Good day. With the announcement of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and the dialing down of the spiraling violence, which we have seen in Jerusalem, various places in Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, it seems to me that this is a good moment to see how the pieces have shifted and to work out who are the winners and who are the losers. Now, before I do that, there is one general observation I must make. This is that obviously I am constrained in what I can say about this conflict. The Duran and this channel are not small enough that I find myself able to express myself freely because I am under the radar, and so what I say and what we say on the Duran doesn't attract notice. And nor are we big enough that our size confers us with that degree of impunity that very large channels, especially mainstream channels, have in the way that they discuss this issue. I'm not here, by the way, referring to comments that people make. People are entirely free to agree or disagree, like or dislike anything that we say on this subject or indeed on any other subject. That is never something that has deterred us from setting out our views. Rather, it is the fact that we are always have to be concerned with what is said by those who manage our platforms. And obviously, if we transgress, then our ability to broadcast anything at all comes into doubt. So we have to be extremely careful. And that means that on the specific topic of the conflict in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in the West Bank, I'm not able to discuss some topics that people talk about at length, which include, for example, the double standards that some people use, the hypocrisies, the strange language, the irrational and dangerous arguments that one hears, and indeed the support for violence from one party or the other that one also hears. On the last point, I should say that as somebody who experienced political violence directly and in a personal way in my childhood in Greece, I have an utter horror of it and a detestation of it, wherever it comes from. But that's all I'm able to say about these topics. And I would say, furthermore, this. If I was to do the kind of program that covers these comments that, spoke about these hypocrisies, these issues in that kind of way, I suspect that I would simply be repeating what lots of other people say on their videos already. People who are perhaps more directly involved in this conflict than me, people who are more experienced about it than me. And I think that I would add little to the general state of knowledge if I did that. So I'm going to do what I consistently do on this channel. I'm going to try to assess the situation in the Middle East after the events of the last few days, look at who's come out stronger and who's come out weaker, and try to do it in an objective and impartial way, applying my own abilities to analyse and assess the situation. I think that is more useful coming from me than it is for me to come along and speak in a more, shall we say, direct and emotional way. Well, first of all, let us look at who are the winners and who are the losers in terms of the parties that were directly engaged in this conflict. Now, I think before doing so, it's important to say that there are divisions, or have been divisions, within both Israel and amongst the Palestinians, which have become increasingly marked over recent years. I'm not going to say that these divisions are in any way analogous, but they have played a role in determining the direction of the conflict over the last couple of days and the direction of events over the last couple of days. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, though Israel's longest serving prime minister, has been for some time now engaged in a tight political struggle with his political rivals for leadership of Israel. For him, this is a very high stakes game because if he loses his position as Israel's prime minister, he is exposed to various criminal cases that are being brought or threatened against him. Now, it is not my purpose here to assess the merits of those cases, which I'm not going to do. It is simply to point out that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been locked in a long political conflict, an exhausting political conflict in Israel, and that for him the stakes are very high. Moreover, in the run-up to this conflict, over the last few days, he seemed to be losing out. He had failed to put together a government out of the various discordant parties in the Knesset, and the Israeli presidency had transferred the task of putting a government together to one of his political rivals. It seems to me that this conflict, therefore, has come at a very good moment for him. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been able to assert himself as the leader who stands up for Israel, who is able to take tough decisions and tough actions against people he classifies as terrorists in Gaza and in Jerusalem. And he's also been able to show that he is the person who is able to unleash the security forces and Israel's military in order to defend the state and to defend Israelis. And I think this has had an impact. The latest information is that the political rival who'd been asked by the Israeli presidency to try and put together a government has failed to do so, making it more likely than not that Prime Minister Netanyahu will remain Israel's prime minister and will continue in office. Now, I accept that is not a certainty. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but personally, I would be surprised if he were to be ousted anytime soon. The simple fact is that irrespective of what your views about Prime Minister Netanyahu are, he is far and away the most experienced political leader Israel has at the moment. He is the person also with the widest range of diplomatic contacts, and I would be surprised if the Israelis thought that this was a good moment to dispense with him. I appreciate that there are some people who have a further view that Netanyahu intentionally stirred up this problem precisely in order to secure his political position in Israel. I have no knowledge about whether or not that is the case. All I am saying is that this particular affair, it seems to me, has turned out well for him. So he must be considered, at this moment in time, a major winner from this affair. Now, turning to the Palestinians, here we have a much deeper and more intractable conflict between the Palestinian Authority, which is based in the West Bank, and Hamas, the Muslim organization associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the large Sunni Muslim organizations which exist in the Middle East and which is based in Gaza, and which many people see around the world as a terrorist organization, not just in Israel, but also in the United States and also in Europe. And these two forces, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, led by Mahmoud Abbas, the long-standing Palestinian president, and Hamas, have been in long-standing rivalry with each other. In fact, that rivalry has been intense and passionate, and it has on several occasions spilled over into outright fighting and violence. Well, it seems to me that Hamas has come out conclusively the winner in this round. The Palestinian Authority has proved completely toothless in the face of this conflict. It has not been able to assert itself in relation to the events in Jerusalem, and it has shown that it can be almost entirely disregarded both by the Israelis and by all the other outside powers. The Russians did contact Mahmoud Abbas, with whom they have a long-standing and historic relationship. He speaks Russian, and the United States President Biden also spoke to him on one occasion over the course of a telephone call. But it became entirely clear as the conflict wore on that the two parties that were in contention were Israel and the Palestinian and Hamas, and that it was Hamas who was doing the fighting and who was grabbing all the attention. The ceasefire, brokered by Egypt, by the way, is a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, with the Palestinian Authority playing no part in it. Now, again, I'm not an expert in inter-Palestinian conflicts, but I would have thought that over time, the effect of this is that Hamas will steadily assert itself, not just in Gaza, but potentially in the West Bank also, and amongst Israeli citizens of Palestinian descent and Muslim belief, as the major leader and champion of the Palestinians, displacing the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, of which the Palestinian Authority is an outgrowth. So Hamas clearly is the winner, and the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, and the PLO are clearly the losers. So that I think gives us a clear assessment of the balance within Israel and Palestine. Who are the winners there? Who are the losers there? Let's look at the regional issues. And it seems to me that it's now becoming increasingly clear that the Middle East is now shaping out increasingly into a conflict between two major powers, with two countries emerging as indisputably the most powerful amongst the various states in the Middle East. One of those powerful countries is Israel. Now, I say that because I know, again, some people find that a difficult fact to absorb or accept, but Israel is indisputably powerful. It has by far the best organized and most powerful military of all the Middle Eastern states. It's the only state in the Middle East to possess nuclear weapons. It has a strong, functioning economy, and it has powerful armed forces and a stable government. I say stable government because obviously, though there are political tensions, like the standoff between Prime Minister Netanyahu and his rivals, nobody doubts the overall political stability of Israel. So Israel is a major player. But the other major player, and I think the big regional winner from this affair, is Iran. Iran has been able to position itself as the supporter of the Palestinians, and it has a close relationship with Hamas. Now, I think this has come as a surprise for many people. Iran, after all, is a Shia state. Hamas is a Sunni organization. It's widely assumed that the fact that Hamas is a Sunni organization and Iran is a Shia state somehow makes the two incompatible with each other. I'm going to say straight away that I think this is based on a misunderstanding of religious differences within the larger Islamic community. I think people overstate or misunderstand the differences between Shia and Sunni, And I think that there is no particular difficulty in Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims working together on on a particular issue or cause. I think a lot of people, when they look at this division within the Muslim world, read it in the West from the perspective of the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in early modern Europe. And I think this is profoundly misleading and is based on a misunderstanding. I'm not going to go into further detail about that. I'm not an expert in that issue. There are volumes and encyclopedias and entire libraries about it. Anyone who wants to research that is welcome to. But suffice to say that Hamas and Iran have friendly contacts, and a victory for Hamas is a victory for Iran. Now, it's not just, of course, with Hamas that Iran is at the moment gaining traction in the Middle East. It's a fact which we pointed out on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, in a recent video, that Iran is currently on a roll. And I noticed, by the way, that there was a very interesting article in the Daily Telegraph by the Oxford academic Mark Armand, which made precisely the same point. I should say that Mark Armand is somebody who is hostile to Iran and is a supporter of Israel, and who laments the fact that Iran is emerging as a big regional winner. But take a step back and look at this in perspective. Iran is currently negotiating with the US in Vienna, with the US clearly moving towards rejoining the JCPOA, and it will do so, moreover, the United States will do so, moreover, on what are essentially Iranian terms. The Iranians are not prepared to negotiate limits on their ballistic missile program, as the Trump administration and the Biden-Harris administration had at one time insisted, and the United States appears to have accepted that. And of course, Iran shows no willingness or agreement to any desire on the part of the United States that it scaled down its foreign policy. So the US will be rejoining the JCPOA fairly soon. Iran will fairly soon be getting sanctions relief, and this is happening with the US moving towards Iran, and with Iran doing nothing, making no significant concessions in return. Moreover, Iran is now in negotiations, and it appears to be close to achieving some form of rapprochement with its major regional Islamic rival, which is Saudi Arabia. There are not so secret talks underway between Iran and Saudi Arabia in Iraq, and the reason for that is the victory of Iran's allies, the Houthis, in the long-standing Yemeni war, in which Saudi Arabia was unwise enough back in 2015 not just to become involved, but to basically launch. The Houthis are about to win in Yemen, and the Saudis, in return, want assurances from Iran that victory that the Houthis are about to achieve in Yemen is not going to translate into a threat to Saudi Arabia itself or to attacks by the Houthis on Saudi oil facilities. So on that basis, with the Saudis recognizing that their venture in Yemen has proved a disastrous failure and that Iran is coming out on top, the Saudis are now talking with the Iranians, seeking a rapprochement and a modus vivendi. This comes on top of the fact that the Iranians are seeing the United States, their major international adversary, pull out of Afghanistan, and with Iraq increasingly under Iranian influence. In the Syrian civil war, President Bashar al-Assad, an ally of Iran, is clearly emerging as the victor. And Hezbollah also seems to be very much a force to be reckoned with in Lebanon too. So things regionally are going very much Iran's way. And of course, Iran has also, over the last few months, been able to secure a major economic deal with China, with the Chinese pledging to invest massive funds in Iranian infrastructure, and it looks like it's going to negotiate, before very long, significant arms supplies from Russia. So Iran looks like it's emerging as the major winner from this conflict in the Middle East. It is aligned with the local winner, which is Hamas, which is winning out against its rival, the Palestinian Authority. Iran has managed to assert itself as the champion, the regional champion, as a result of the Palestinians and of that faction of the Palestinians which is most actively resisting. And it is seeing, in general, diplomacy and politics and regional events in the Middle East play out increasingly to its advantage. So Israel and Iran are increasingly looking like the two strongest powers in the Middle East. There are other powers too. Egypt played a role in negotiating, brokering this ceasefire. It was the Egyptians who spoke to both Hamas and to Israel, and who seem to have been the key intermediaries and mediators. And Egypt, with its powerful armed forces, will remain a major force. However, it's also the case that Egypt, for one reason or another, has become increasingly marginalized in Middle East diplomacy ever since it made its peace agreement with Israel back in the 1970s. It has never exercised the kind of influence in the Middle East that it did in the 1960s and early 1970s when it was led by Arab nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser. So though Egypt remains an important power, it is not a power that can directly challenge or rival Iran. Saudi Arabia also remains a major power. It remains the richest of the Gulf states. It remains a critical supplier of oil. It is still in control, very much in control, of the key holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, and it has a very active and effective intelligence operation which functions and operates right across the Middle East. It cannot be considered totally displaced or counted out, but for the moment at least, it is having to play second to Iran, following its defeat in Yemen and its failure to overthrow the Assad government in Damascus. And there is a third power, which is, of course, Turkey, led by President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, President Erdogan has at various times also wanted to position himself as the major Muslim strongman, the supporter of the Palestinians, and a major player in the Middle East. That is what his neo-Ottoman foreign policy is all about. However, once again, this conflict has exposed the limitations of his foreign policy. The fact is that ever since President Erdogan made the disastrous decision back in 2012 to back the attempt to overthrow his erstwhile friend and ally, President Assad of Syria, Turkey and Erdogan himself have lacked leverage in the Middle East. Without the support of Syria, which is allied to Iran, but which is hostile to Turkey, Turkey cannot influence directly events in the Palestinian territories or in Lebanon or in this part of the world. President Erdogan can make all kinds of rhetorical flourishes, but they are of no actual political significance. It's probably frustrating to him, but the fact is that he has been sidelined in this conflict by Iran, with which he has tetchy relations, largely as a result of his own whimsical and idiosyncratic policies, which involved him in a war in Syria, which it was very much in his advantage, and that of Turkey to stay out of. As a result, he cannot match his rhetoric and his ambitions with practical actions on the ground. He must be counted a loser from this affair. However, the biggest loser of all, in my opinion, is the United States of America, the dominant power in the Middle East ever since it began to assert itself there in the late 1960s and early 1970s, when it sought successfully to end Soviet influence in the Middle East. The United States has proved totally ineffectual over the course of this conflict. No important US diplomat has visited the Middle East and has spoken directly, face to face, with the various parties involved in the conflict. Secretary of State Blinken has announced now that the immediate conflict is over, that he intends to travel to Israel at the end of this month. But of course, this is very much a case of closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. The United States, for all its brave words, did not negotiate or broker the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Egypt did. And part of the reason why it did not do so is because, of course, it doesn't speak to Hamas. It only speaks to the Palestinian Authority, led by Mahmoud Abbas, and the Palestinian Authority has been shown to be completely ineffective. But beyond that, the United States doesn't speak clearly or strongly to Israel either. President Biden, like his predecessor, President Obama, makes little secret of the fact that he doesn't care very much for Prime Minister Netanyahu. The result is that he delayed many weeks after his inauguration before he finally spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And when he did speak to him over the course of the current conflict, he had very little of any meaningful sort to say. The United States did obstruct meetings of the Security Council and did prevent statements being made there, but it came up with no real constructive ideas of its own. The Biden-Harris administration has not appointed a Middle East envoy. It seems disinclined to do so. And overall, one gets a very powerful impression that it would rather that the whole Middle East and that the whole conflict there went away. I would add that it is almost certainly hampered in its actions by divisions which have now emerged within the Democratic Party in the United States. The left of the Democratic Party is now increasingly asserting itself as anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian in a way that would have been inconceivable even a few years ago. That has made it impossible for the Democrats to use their position in Congress to make the kind of strong statements about the Middle East that they once would have done. In fact, it is remarkable that the US Congress has been silent about this conflict, even as it has played itself out. I would add that I'm receiving information from an acquaintance, somebody that I used to work with quite closely at one time, and who tells me that he was once heavily involved in lobbying on behalf of Israel in Congress. I mean, I don't know that for a fact. That's what he tells me, but I believe it to be true. And he tells me that he and other people like him are dismayed by the failure of Congress, including, by the way, the failure of some Republicans to talk out strongly in support of Israel over the course of this conflict. Well, you may think that the United States has been too closely aligned with Israel over the last few years, but I would say that the fact of the American alliance with Israel gave the United States, until very recently, a great deal of leverage in the Middle East. The fact was that the only way various countries in the Middle East and outside it could, in effect, persuade Israel to dial down its policies was by talking to Washington, because it was Washington which, as Israel's major ally, was seen as having the greatest influence over it. With the US essentially withdrawing at least some of that support, US influence in Israel has declined, and it's becoming increasingly clear that the Israelis are paying ever less attention to what the Americans are telling them. The fact that the US has been shown to be relatively ineffectual over the course of this crisis is now being noted across the Middle East. It is the fundamental reason, the ultimate reason, why countries like Saudi Arabia are talking to Iran, and why Egypt is stepping in and is brokering deals between Hamas and Israel, which it might have been unwilling to do before. So, what is the overall view one can take from this? It seems to me that we are in the early stages of a general American retreat from the Middle East. The United States clearly is no longer the big active player in the Middle East that it used to be. It doesn't control policy in Saudi Arabia. Its alliance, its former unbreakable alliance with Israel, has been weakened. It's losing positions in Iraq, and it is withdrawing from Afghanistan. I expect that before very long, we're going to see what this withdrawal gain in momentum, and I would not be surprised if within 5 years, say, we saw all the major US forces in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere, withdrawn entirely. Two strong powers remain: Iran and Israel. How the Middle East shapes out over the next few years will depend on the interactions between the two. For the moment, they are deadly rivals. Israel and Iran are constantly sparring with each other and maneuvering against each other for position. But perhaps one day, who knows, that may change, and they may start to maintain some kind of dialogue with each other, as tends to happen when two powerful rivals appear and displace all the rest. In the meantime, I think we are going to see a post-American Middle East with Israel and Iran playing it out between them like two chess players playing chess across the Middle East, treating the Middle East as their board. I hope this board game remains under some sort of control, and that the two governments of these two powerful countries understand that there are limits to what each can do. But the questions of war and peace in the Middle East, it seems to me, are increasingly going to be decided by them. Israel certainly will have to think about a future without the United States, and Iran, for its part, may start to think of a future where opportunities are created because of the retreat of the United States. In either case, the future in the Middle East will be decided by them. Thank you for joining me for this program on this channel. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also check out Alex Christophorou's channel, and you'll find links under this video. Please also join us on our other platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. And please also support us to the extent that you feel able to via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Lastly, don't forget to go to our Discord server and check out our shop and see the wonderful things we have there. Our amazing t-shirts, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and our famous magic mugs. And thank you for joining me for this program, and I look forward to you joining me again in future programs. And until then, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. All sorts of strange things are happening to our subscriptions also. And have a wonderful day in the meantime, and until then. Thank you very much.